Picture this. It's the late 1800s. You're a young 18-year-old girl in a small rural town. You try to go about things in your life the way any person normally would, but not so secretly. Every day, you are plagued by knockings on your wall, objects that follow you, and even threats scratched into the wall above your bed. It may seem surreal, but between the years 1878 and 1879, this was the reality for Esther Cox. After years of haunting at the hands of a malevolent poltergeist, Esther's life would be changed forever. Was a poltergeist really manifested through the strong emotional energy of a young woman? Or was this a cry for help after being the victim of sexual assault? On today's episode, we'll explore the life of Esther Cox and the poltergeist that haunted her for almost 2 years. A story that has become known as the Great Amherst Mystery. Hello everyone, and I'd like to welcome you back to a new chapter of the Insidious Agenda podcast. As always, I'm your host Nick, and on this week's episode, we're going to explore an event that's come to be known as the Great Amherst Mystery. So ensure you're subscribed to this podcast so you don't miss any of our weekly episodes. It's time to turn out your lights, close your eyes, let things go quiet, and just listen for a moment. Maybe you're alone. Maybe you're not. Now, follow my voice as we travel back in time to the late 1800s and the small rural town of Amherst, Nova Scotia. On the eastern seaboard of Canada, on the isthmus that connects the provinces of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, lies the rural town of Amherst. Today, Amherst is a hub town and a popular stop for travelers as they pass between the two provinces. Like most of Nova Scotia, the town and surrounding area is truly beautiful. However, in 1878, it was a town marred by paranormal occurrences. The subject of these happenings was a young girl named Esther Cox, and the supposed poltergeist that haunted her steps. Esther herself was born in the town of Eastville, near Upper Stewiacke in Nova Scotia, on the 28th of March in 1860. She was the daughter of her parents, Archibald and Esther Cox. The couple together would bring 6 children into the world, of which Esther was the youngest. Unfortunately, Esther's mother would pass away when she was just 3 weeks old. It was at this point that all of Esther's siblings were separated, and she was sent to live with her paternal grandparents. She would stay with them until she turned 17, and would then be sent to Amherst to live with her sister Olive and 2 of her other siblings being Jane and William. The family lived in a small, crowded 2-story cottage that belonged to Olive's husband, Daniel Teed. Also living in the home at the time were Olive and Daniel's 2 young children, Willie and George, as well as Daniel's brother John. Daniel was the main source of income for the family and held a prestigious position of foreman at the local shoe factory. Over the years, Esther came to dedicate her life to taking care of her sister's children and taking care of the home, cooking and cleaning for everyone that resided there. At this time in history, it was expected that Esther would have been told to act like a proper lady and to take pride in the maintenance and function of her home, the ultimate goal of which, to eventually be married. Esther would be described by Mr. Walter Hubble as the following. Esther's disposition is naturally mild and gentle. She can, at times, however, be very self-willed and is bound to have her own way when her mind is made up. If asked to do anything she does not feel like doing, she becomes very sulky, and has to be humored at times to keep peace in the family. However, all things considered, she is a good little girl, and has always borne a good reputation, in every sense of the word. Eventually, a young man from the town of Amherst by the name of Bob McNeil would eventually take a liking to Esther. Bob was not very well thought of by Esther's sisters, especially by Olive. Olive thought that Bob, who was very good looking, was poor and not a suitable match for her Esther. Not much is known of the connection or courtship, with the exception of the one night that Bob and Esther spent together. That's believed to be the catalyst for the things that would follow. As the story goes, one night, after Esther and Bob had been out together, she returned home in a state, visibly distraught, crying, and behaving hysterically. At some point during their night together, it is believed that Bob attempted to sexually assault Esther. He pulled over the carriage, got out, and pulled out a gun, which he pointed directly at Esther. He threatened to kill her if she didn't get out of the carriage they were in. Bob was about to fire the weapon at Esther, but was forced to leave the scene and drive her back home with all haste, for another carriage had approached, which scared him. The night was dark and stormy, as heavy rain was falling in Amherst that evening. Esther arrived back home, soaking wet, and immediately ran upstairs. Bob drove off into the dark of the night and would never be heard from again for quite some time. Over the course of the next 4 days, Esther was bedridden, whether suffering from a broken heart or getting over the shock of what happened. Her family knew something had happened to Esther, but didn't press her with any questions. They found no joy in the fact that she was not very forthcoming, but did find a bit of solace in the fact that Bob was no longer coming around. Overall, Esther would not find much sympathy or warmth from her entire family, especially from her sister Jane. On the evening of the 4th of September, about a week after the events between Esther and Bob, Jane and her sister, who had shared a room, settled into bed for the evening. Jane would tell Esther that she believed she was beginning to lose her mind and may have to be committed to an insane asylum, lest she righted her course. The two girls had been asleep for only 15 minutes before Esther shot up out of bed, screaming and wild. She exclaimed that there was a mouse under the bed as she felt it moving beneath the linens. Jane, who was equally as scared of mice as Esther, also shot up out of bed to help her sister investigate. After 15 minutes had gone by, with no sign of any mouse, the girls settled back to sleep. However, the following night, the mouse had returned. The girls made a plan to take care of the mouse once and for all, when they noticed a green box under the bed was moving. They pulled out the box from underneath the bed and placed it in the middle of the room when the box leapt a foot into the air and came to rest on its side. They corrected the position of the box when it jumped a second time. They screamed as loudly as they could for Daniel. After Daniel had come into the room to find nothing amiss, he put the box back under the bed and told the girls to lay back down and go to sleep. The next day, the girls spoke to each other and knew in their hearts what they saw. They went about their day strolling through town and running errands. After supper that evening, Esther claimed she was feeling a bit feverish and went to bed shortly after 8 o'clock. Jane would follow about 2 hours later, and, as it had been the past 2 nights, Esther shot out of bed, taking all of her sheets and blankets with her in a panic. She exclaimed to Jane that she thought she was dying. Jane's response to Esther was quite comforting. "Dying people don't speak in that loud tone. Wait until I light the lamp. Don't die in the dark, Esther." When the lamp was finally lit, Jane saw a sight that she would never forget. Esther was in the center of the room with her hair standing straight up. Her face was blood red and her eyes looked like they would pop straight out of their sockets. Esther called for help from Jane, who was absolutely terrified. The calls, however, were heard by the rest of the family. Olive entered first, who tried to calm down Esther, and was shortly followed by Daniel, John, and William. Esther's family thought she had finally gone mad, but helped her get back into bed. They witnessed her body fluctuate between hot and cold temperatures. With the family trying their best to comfort Esther from her current state, a loud boom that sounded like thunder was heard from within the room. Olive immediately ran out of her room to check on her children, who were fine. When she returned, Olive next went to the window to find out if it was something on the street. She opened the blind and found nothing was amiss. The street was relatively quiet. However, when she returned the blind to the resting position on its windowsill, 3 more booms were heard in the room. It was so loud they shook the entire room. But as quickly as the phenomena came, it went, and Esther returned to her normal self. Jane would remain by her sister's side for the rest of the evening, but didn't sleep. Following this night, Jane and Esther would be offered about 4 nights reprieve from any happenings when this strange occurrence would happen once again. Esther tried to get into bed and be as still as she could, but shortly after retiring for the evening, the linens on her bed shot off and landed in the corner of her room. Both girls screamed, and the ordeal would cause Jane to faint. The rest of the home's inhabitants again came into the room to see what was the matter. Olive had just finished placing the bedclothes back onto Esther and Jane when a pillow was ripped from beneath Esther's head by an unseen force and was thrown directly at John. John would have no further involvement in this and wouldn't return to the room. William, who had run to get some water from the kitchen to cool Esther down, returned to the room and more banging was heard from beneath the bed. Like the night before, as quick as the phenomena had started, it subsided, and everyone went back to sleep. In the morning, the family decided it was time to call a doctor. Dan left the factory early that afternoon to fetch Dr. Carit. Dr. Carit arrived at the family home about 10 o'clock and examined Esther. Dr. Carit had noticed that Esther was exhibiting some symptoms of shock, but would soon witness the paranormal phenomena for himself. The loud banging from underneath her bed commenced again. The sound followed Dr. Carit around her room. After the banging had subsided, the bedclothes shot off the bed again. What happened next is probably the one thing most synonymous with the Great Amherst mystery. Then came the horrible sound of something being scratched into the wall above the bed was heard. Everyone in the room would bear witness to what was written into the wall. Esther Cox, you are mine to kill. The words scratched into the wall had appeared where there was nothing before. Each member of the family looked around the room at one another so they could see no one was deceived, and the writing was genuine. Dr. Carit stood in the doorway of the room, trying to make sense of what had just happened, when a piece of plaster came flying off the wall in his direction. Luckily for Dr. Carit, the plaster changed course in midair and fell at his feet. Like the phenomena before, he could not make sense of what caused it. The banging in the room began again, with a renewed energy that shook the entire room. During all of this, Esther remained in bed, scared to death of what was happening. The doctor would finally depart for the evening, but would return first thing in the morning as he had promised. Esther was notably shaken to the point of trepidation, for she had gone down to the cellar of the home, only to come running back up, out of breath. She exclaimed there was someone in the cellar who had thrown objects at her. The doctor went to the basement to investigate and confirmed that no one was present and nothing was out of place. He asked Esther to return down to the cellar with him to see for herself. When she entered the cellar with him, several potatoes were thrown at them. They quickly retreated back upstairs and the doctor left the residence. He would return again that evening to administer a sedative to Esther. He remained for a few hours and everything remained quiet until he left. The banging and other loud noises would begin again. They continued even as he left the home and could be heard hundreds of yards away from the cottage. Dr. Carit would return to the home nearly every evening, but knew he was helpless against the entity that haunted Esther. One evening, about 3 weeks after his first visit, the family stood around Esther's bed as the ritual knocking went on. Esther threw her arms toward the head of the bed and began convulsing. Her body was as cold as ice, and she was perfectly rigid. In her tortured state, she began talking about what happened between her and Bob McNeil on their ride that one fateful evening. This was the first time she had told any of her family about what had happened. When Esther had finally returned to a more calm state, her family had begun to ask her about what she told them. Esther broke out in tears, claiming that every bit of what she told them was true. He had threatened her life at gunpoint and was scared off by another carriage that had approached. This would only confirm the family's belief that Bob was a horrible person, and a conspiracy theory had begun to develop that Bob was the one behind all of the happenings at the house. 3 loud knocks were heard in the room as the family began to believe the entity could understand them. 3 more followed and were heard as loudly as before. The family would begin to ask questions to confirm its knowledge. They would ask questions such as, how many people were present? The entity would entertain the family, knocking 5 times, 1 for each of the people present. Esther's family would be tormented for the next 3 weeks. No one knew exactly when it would come. Sometimes it began in the morning and continued throughout the entire day. Other times, it would only come after Esther had fallen asleep. They came to realize that the manifestations were only around when Esther was present at the home, and that they were certainly absent during the periods that she would be away. It was about a month after the torment and manifestations began when the clergy would finally be involved. Dr. Edwin Clay, a Baptist clergyman, visited the Teed home and was able to converse with the entity through the knocking, just like before. Although the usual knocking would be present, the entity would make louder knocks in response to his questions. Dr. Clay would witness the death threat to Esther scratched into the wall, and, after leaving the home, was convinced that the phenomena was genuine. Among other clergymen to visit the home, Reverend R.A. Temple, a Wesleyan pastor, witnessed a bucket of cold water become agitated while resting on the kitchen table. Unfortunately for the Teed family, with prominent members of the village having paid calls to their home to investigate, this also began to draw a myriad of other visitors. Large crowds began to gather outside the home, hoping to witness some of the happenings for themselves. At times, the police had to be called upon to keep order. Many of these people gathering outside the home held true to the belief that everything was a fraud, especially Dr. Nathan Tupper. Dr. Tupper was convinced of this belief, as he had never witnessed any of the manifestations during his time at the home. Even Dr. Carit, who had still called daily, eventually gave up trying to understand and generate a theory surrounding the happenings and became only a passive spectator. That December, Esther became sick and, after contracting diphtheria, was bedridden for over the course of the next 2 weeks. It's important to note that during this time, the manifestations, the banging, everything associated with the paranormal had ceased in its entirety. When she recovered, Esther would travel to visit her sister in Sackville, New Brunswick, Mrs. Snowden. While staying with her, Esther, again, was completely free of manifestations. Upon Esther's return to the cottage, some of the most startling parts of her haunting began to develop. While she was away, the family switched her and Jane's room to a different part of the house. Esther told her sister that she had begun hearing voices. Voices that would tell her that their home was to be set on fire that evening. Whatever voice had told Esther this also told her that it had once walked the earth, but had been dead for some time. Dr. Clay, who was present with the family during this time, believed it could potentially be caused by electricity. However, with no electricity currently running to the home, Daniel Teed absolutely protested this claim. Owing to the beliefs of the time, he would state that electricity can't set the house on fire unless it comes in the form of lightning. While debating the electrical theory, a lit match dropped from the ceiling onto Esther's bed. This would certainly have started a fire had Jane not put it out so quickly. Throughout the next 10 or so minutes, about 8 to 10 more matches fell from the bed and around other parts of the room. Fortunately, the family was able to put them out before they could cause any damage. The loud knockings would continue, even in the new room, which offered the family a chance to converse again with the entity. Daniel questioned the entity as to whether or not a fire would actually be started in the home. The entity knocked 3 times for the affirmative, and not 5 minutes later, a fire was started. The entity took a dress that belonged to Esther, balled it up, and before any of the family could remove it from under the bed, the spirit had set it ablaze. The fire, however, was extinguished quickly. Worry began to grow amongst Daniel and Olive that the entity may start a fire in some inaccessible place in the home that would raze it to the ground. Their biggest fear was that it would happen in the dead of night. Dr. Clay, who generated the theory that the fires were likely caused by electricity, began to believe in an alternative theory, since he agreed with Daniel that electricity could not freely roam a person's home. He believed that the phenomena was genuine, since Esther could hear it speak, and it always did what it said it was going to do, that it was definitely a ghost, or else the devil himself. About 3 days after the dress was lit ablaze, Olive and Esther were downstairs. Olive was churning butter, and Esther was seated in the dining room when Olive began to notice smoke in the house. She and Esther were utterly paralyzed with fear. The moment they had so dreaded was finally upon them. The house was set on fire, set by the devilish entity itself. Olive grabbed a bucket of water and rushed into the cellar. There, she noticed a barrel of wood shavings was ablaze, reaching almost as high as the floor above it. Olive's bucket of water was not enough to quench the flames, and she had spilled more than half of it on her way down. The 2 girls had begun to suffocate on the thick, black smoke that billowed throughout the small cellar. The 2 girls burst out of the cellar and into the street, screaming, "Fire! Fire!" Their cry was heard by a passing gentleman who was a stranger in the village. He happened to be passing by and rushed into the cottage, where he was able to extinguish the blaze with a mat from the dining room. He put out the fire in its entirety, and, without waiting to be thanked, he walked out of the cottage and was soon lost to view in the distance. The strange thing about this man was that no one knew who he was or where he had come from. Even more bizarre was from that day he was never seen again. This event, as terrifying as it was, began to dispel some of the fraudulent beliefs held amongst the community of Amherst. For no person could set fire to a barrel of shavings and be in another room of the house at the exact same time. Even Olive's children were playing in the front yard at the time, which confirmed that it also couldn't have been them. The family, knowing of the events that had been plaguing them the past few months, knew that the fires were genuine. The fire department, however, was not convinced and genuinely believed it to have been Esther herself that had started the fires. The villagers of Amherst, however, held very differing opinions on the matter. Perhaps the most detestable belief was held by Dr. Tupper. He believed that if Esther's behavior was to be corrected, that she needed a good rawhide whip across her back, and that the manifestations would cease immediately. Thankfully for Esther, no one had the right or power to beat her. Throughout the next week, the manifestations continued to take place every day and grew in strength. The villagers worried that if fire did break out and Daniel Teed's house went ablaze, that it could potentially spread and ignite the entire town. After months of torment, Esther and her family were sitting in the parlor one evening, and the ghost finally appeared before them. Esther rose to her feet, paralyzed with fear. She pointed, her hand trembling, at a distant corner of the room, and exclaimed in a broken voice,
"Look there! Look there! My God, it is the ghost! Don't you all see him? There he stands, all in gray. See how his eyes are glaring at me? And he laughs at me when he says I must leave the house tonight or he'll start a fire in the loft and burn us all to death. Oh, what shall I do? Where shall I go? The ground is covered with snow, and yet I cannot remain. For he will do what he threatens. He always does. Oh, I wish I were dead."
The family knew that no one in the community would take Esther in, as they all feared the entity that haunted the home. It would then occur to Daniel that John White, one of the members of the community who had taken a deep interest in the manifestations and gave pity on Esther, may take her in. Daniel got dressed and went to John White's home. After knocking for some time, John opened the door. After a quick conversation with Daniel and then his wife, John was willing to take Esther in, and there she would stay that evening. The charity of John White and his wife to take in Esther was something that no one else in the village would have the heart to do. In his memoirs of the event, it would later be recounted by Walter Hubble that he believed the Whites were really heaven intervening, imbuing at least two hearts with the greatest virtue of all, charity. December had passed, and by now it was January of 1879. It had been 4 months since the phenomena began. Esther had now been living with the Whites for about 2 weeks, and had not witnessed any more of the ghost or its manifestations. Esther's demeanor had improved greatly over those 2 weeks, and Mrs. White found her to be a great assistance in the home. She treated Esther with a great kindness. Unfortunately for Esther, this solace would not last. Around the end of the 3rd week with the Whites, the ghost returned. One day, while she was scrubbing the hall, her scrub brush disappeared from her hand. The ghost had told Esther he had taken it. She was so alarmed, she screamed for Mrs. White, who, with her daughter Mary, searched for the brush, but nothing could be found. Just after they had finished searching, the brush mysteriously fell from the ceiling, grazing Esther's head during the fall. Not wanting to risk a fire breaking out in his house, John White was able to convince Esther to remain during the day at his dining saloon. While Esther was working in the dining saloon, many inhabitants of Amherst would witness new phenomena, and would even attempt to see the manifestations for themselves. One morning while she was working there, a door on one of the ovens began to open and close on its own. Mr. White was able to wedge an axe handle into the oven door so that it could not open or close under its own power. Not to be outsmarted, The ghost pulled the oven door off its hinges, dislodged the axe handle, and sent both objects into the air. They would come crashing down onto the floor. Mr. White would then call in Mr. William Rogers, an inspector of fisheries, Nova Scotia. On another occasion, a small knife belonging to Mr. White's son Fred was ripped from his hand by the ghost and stabbed Esther in the back. The ghost would leave the knife lodged in the wound. Fred immediately removed the knife, cleaned it, and returned it to his pocket. The ghost, however, was not done. It ripped the knife from his pocket and in an instant lodged it back within the same wound. Fred would regain the knife, and this time hid it so that it could not be found, even by the ghost. One of the attempts to cure Esther of the manifestations was an experiment of putting 3 or 4 large iron spikes on Esther's lap. To the astonishment of everyone involved, the ghost did not move the spikes. However, the spikes became too hot to touch. Only a moment after this was noticed, they were thrown from Esther's lap to a corner of the dining room about 20 feet away. It was often that while Esther was working in the saloon, the ghost would move some of the furniture, even once moving a box that weighed 50 pounds, approximately 15 feet, with no effort. The knocking sounds themselves also continued in the saloon and would draw a great number of visitors from the town. Towards the end of March, Esther traveled to St. John, New Brunswick, as a guest of Captain James Beck. She remained at the home for 3 weeks under the protection of Mrs. Beck. While in Sackville, she was investigated by a group of men who were heavily involved in the scientific community. They witnessed some of the common manifestations, the knocking, the moving of furniture, etc. It was at the home of the Becks that the other ghosts had begun to finally come forward and converse with Esther and the investigators. 2 of the ghosts gave their names, Peter Cox and Maggie Fisher. Both spirits claimed to have lived on the earth before, but neither spirit was as powerful as the original fire demon at the Teeds cottage. The original ghost did come forward as well, claiming his name was Bob Nickel. Bob told Esther that he had once lived on Earth and had been a shoemaker. The ghost of Peter Cox claimed to have been a relative of Esther's who had once departed the Earth about 40 years ago. Peter was likely a benevolent spirit, claiming to have done everything he could to prevent Bob and Maggie from breaking the articles they threw and using profane language. Esther would remain with the Becks in St. John for approximately 3 weeks before she returned to Amherst. Upon returning home, she would accept the invitation of a Mr. and Mrs. Van Amberg to stay with them. The Van Ambergs only lived about 3 miles from Amherst. She remained with their family for a period of 8 weeks, during which she was able to live a calm life at their farm in the woods. After the 8 weeks had passed, she returned to her normal routine, living at the Teeds cottage and employed during the day at the White's dining saloon. The manifestations would soon begin again, and they were as powerful as they had ever been. It would be at this time that Walter Hubble closed out his arrangement with the company he was a member of in Newfoundland and returned to Amherst. Here, he hoped to expose Esther Cox and put a bookend on the Great Amherst mystery. He had arrived at the Teed home on the 21st of June, 1879. He had only been seated at their dining table for about 15 minutes when his umbrella was thrown across the room. Walter would then move to the parlor, taking his bag with him. He was seated only a moment when his bag was thrown across the room. Within moments, a large chair in the room was thrown at him, nearly striking him. He left the home to go for a walk. When he returned, the devilish behavior was waiting for him. 7 chairs in the parlor were simultaneously knocked over. Not wanting to remain in the room, he retired back to the dining room, where the chairs there exhibited the same behavior. Esther would inform him that he would soon get used to that behavior, and Mr. Hubble stated that he would remain to investigate lest the spirit drove him away from the home. The ghosts began to hammer on the table, while Mr. Hubble noticed that Esther's feet and hands were in full view, and she was not the one purporting this. After dinner, he laid down in the parlor to take a nap, and noticed that Esther had come in for a newspaper. He watched her very closely, keeping one eye open so that she would think he was asleep. A large glass paperweight flew across the room from a shelf that it had been on. He became so intrigued that he sat up and asked Esther to remain in the room. One of the Teed's children, George, came into the room, and Esther put him in her lap in the rocking chair. The ghost ripped off one of George's shoes and threw it at Mr. Hubble, striking him in the head. The rest of the day went by without incident. Nothing further would transpire that night, much to Walter's surprise. The next day was a Sunday, and it seemed to Walter that the ghost respected the Sabbath, for no phenomena ever took place on that day. However, when the sun rose on Monday morning, the manifestations would begin again. During breakfast, one of the china lids disappeared from the coffee table, and about 10 minutes later, fell from the ceiling. The chairs would fall over, and several mats would be thrown about the room. When he retired to the parlor after breakfast, to Walter's astonishment, a plant was moved to the center of the room from a windowsill, and 2 empty bottles were thrown at him. To climax the evening, the ghost removed little George's clothes, and Bob, the head ghost, started a fire upstairs. Bob and the other ghosts would pile the chairs in the parlor one on top of another until it was about 6 feet high. As if in jest, they pulled those out from underneath, causing them all to crash to the floor. The phenomena continued on Tuesday, when Walter decided he would try to converse with the ghosts. While in the parlor, all of the ghosts communicated with him. Bob Nickel, Maggie Fisher, and Peter Cox, all who were known before. 3 other ghosts would also make themselves known. They were Mary Fisher, Maggie's sister, Jane Nickel, and Eliza McNeil. The second set of 3 ghosts, however, were not as active. They would normally roam the home and occasionally upset something. As there were now 6 that had come forward, and all were present, Walter decided to ask numerous questions. Have you all lived on Earth? Yes. Have you seen God? No. Are you in heaven? No. Are you in hell? Yes. And his final question, have you seen the devil? Yes. Over the next few days, Esther was repeatedly attacked. At one point, pins appeared as though out of thin air and attacked Esther. Walter recalled pulling about 30 pins from her that were lodged into her body. One afternoon, the family cat was thrown about 5 feet by one of the ghosts. At one point, while Esther had descended from her room upstairs, the chair from that room followed her. The only other person in the home was Olive, who was in the kitchen. On the 26th of June, 2 or 3 matches fell from the ceiling to Walter Hubble's feet. Being a smoker, Walter requested the ghost to throw down a few more, to which they obliged. Approximately another 45 would come down during the day, and another 49 during the afternoon. On the 28th, the sound of a trumpet was heard by the family throughout the home, from early morning until late evening. Finally, Bob would relent and let the trumpet fall to the floor in one of the rooms. Over the course of the next 6 weeks with the family, many more things happened. Esther was out one day, walking and praying with Reverend Temple. When she returned, she was cut on her head with an old bone from the yard, and a moment afterwards was stabbed in the face with a fork. While in the home, the ghost would throw knives at Mr. Hubble, which were fortunately for him dull. Esther would also enter into mesmeric sleep in which she would converse with the unseen, one of whom was even her dead mother. When waking from this state, she would always say she was in heaven among the angels. She would face the same bodily swelling phenomena and continued to wish for death. She would have several attacks of this kind during Walter's stay at the home. By the later part of July, the manifestations grew so powerful that Esther could no longer stay in the home. Fires were continually started. The walls were being destroyed by furniture, bedclothes were being removed, and even strange voices could be heard calling the family members' names in broad daylight. This was all too much to handle. If the ghosts continued to gain strength, it was feared they would possess the house and all within. But, like it had been before, there was only one remedy. Esther would have to leave the home. So, one day, she would pack up all of her possessions, say goodbye to the family she loved so dearly, and set off from the Teeds' cottage, never to return again. Esther would continue to live with the Van Ambergs at their farm, where all of the manifestations ceased. It was believed that if she was to return to the Teeds' home, that they would only begin again. Walter would travel to see her on the night of the 1st of August, 1879, and would find her making a patchwork quilt. She would tell Walter that she read the Bible regularly and was content and happy for the first time in a long time. Before he departed, Walter informed her that she should pray regularly, else she would again be possessed by devils. Much like Esther had moved on, so had the Teeds, with everything going back to normal in their cottage. In Mr. Hubble's closing words in his book, he believes that, owing to him having such a remarkable experience, that this was in fact a true ghost story. This, however, would not be the end of Esther and Mr. Hubble's relationship. For together, they would work with John White, embarking on a speaking tour and sharing her story. At one of these events, she was heckled, causing a disturbance, and the speaking tour was abandoned after only 2 events. She would then return to Amherst and find work with a man named Arthur Davidson. An unfortunate event happened where Mr. Davidson's barn burned to the ground, and he accused Esther of arson. With the events from her past following her, she was convicted and sentenced to 4 months in prison, of which she served only 1 after protests by the public. After her conviction, the phenomena ceased for good, with one theory believing that she was cured by a Mi'kmaq shaman. There's no further evidence to support this, but it could be a plausible theory nonetheless. Esther would go on to marry twice, having 2 children, 1 with each husband. She would eventually move to the town of Brockton, Massachusetts, with her second husband. Esther would live a relatively peaceful life, and would pass away at the age of 52 on the 8th of November in 1912. During the later years of her life, in 1907, she was visited by a researcher named Hereward Carrington. After having a conversation with Esther, and he also spoke with her sister Olive, he was inclined to believe the events to be genuine. He believed that the family would have been less likely to stick to the story as the years ticked by. Other researchers of the account have gone on to believe that these events were a hoax, owing to the experiences, such as the times Esther was away from the home, that all phenomena would cease altogether, especially during the times of illness and her battle with diphtheria, when the phenomena would cease altogether. There are only 2 directions the story of Esther Cox can really go. The first, and most believed, is that she perpetrated a hoax. She would cry for attention after a potential sexual assault and the events with Bob McNeil. It's also possible that her sister Jane would have also contributed to these events as well, owing they shared a room together. Or perhaps Esther was unsatisfied, living a life of servitude where her day centered around cooking and cleaning. Esther was also a teenager at the time of the happenings, leading some of the things that may have been perpetrated, such as profane language, to have been owed to her age. It's also possible that Walter Hubble, being an actor himself, could have likely embellished some of the facts in his story to enhance his publicity. The second explanation is that the Great Amherst Mystery and the infestation of the poltergeist, ghosts, or demons is in fact genuine. So much research has been done to discredit the happenings surrounding Esther Cox and the Teed family. Would Esther Cox really have known the symptoms of poltergeist activity, being 18 years old and with no access to the technology of today? Certainly, the loud noises, the moving objects, and incessant banging and knocking were so frequent throughout the haunting that they could have been done by a girl that young. Certainly, with the length of time having gone by, especially in an era when things traveled by word of mouth, some of the witness accounts are quite vague. However, in my opinion, they do lend credit to the fact that the experience was genuine. There's certainly no way to know for sure. The only thing that remains is the Great Amherst Mystery, and the story of Esther Cox will remain just that, a mystery. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the story of Esther Cox and the Great Amherst Mystery. Please visit our Linktree and leave us a review or rating about this episode, and remember to follow our social media pages. I would like to give a big thank you to my dear friend Cassie Baxter for her vocal talents in bringing the voice of Esther Cox to life for today's episode. Needless to say, this won't be the last time you hear Cassie's voice on this podcast. Please be a friend and tell a friend about the Insidious Agenda podcast. If you would like to show your support, donations can be made to our PayPal account in the Linktree. So come back next week as we travel south of the border to the state of Tennessee and explore the story of the haunting of the Bell Witch. New episodes are released every Tuesday morning at 5 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. But for now, it's time to close the cover of the Insidious Agenda. I'll see you again next week.